Olá, bom dia, sejam muito bem-vindos. Nosso debate hoje é em inglês, então vou passar agora para o inglês. Hello, good morning. My name is Julia Dias Leite. I'm the CEO of CEBRI, the Brazilian Center for International Relations. And this is an event together in partnership with the China-Brazil Business Council, CEBC. And I would like to welcome here Cláudia Trevisan, Ambassador Castro Neves, and our dear friend Arthur Krober. Is also a partnership with Dragonomics, Geopolitical Dragonomics, and also with support of Suzano. I would like to thank Dragonomics and Suzano for this partnership. And then I would like to welcome here our super speaker. Usually we have Arthur here personal. We have been inviting him to Brazil for the last 15 years. And now still online, but hopefully next year we'll have Arthur with us to do the updates of what's going on in China. And the event today is how China will navigate global storms. Arthur has followed China for the past 3 decades, and he founded the Research Dragonomics in Beijing, which will merge with Geopolitical in 2011. The debate today will be conducted by Executive Director of CEBC, Cláudia Trevisan. And I'll pass now to Ambassador Castro Neves, who is the chairman of CEBC and also the Vice President Emeritus of CEBRI. So welcome. You have the floor, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Julia. We are again here, have the pleasure of having Arthur Krober with us, an old friend, as Julia has already pointed out. Let me introduce myself. I'm Luiz Augusto de Castro Neves. I'm chairman of the Brazil-China Business Council, and as Julia said, Vice President Emeritus of the Brazilian Center for International Relations. I would also like to thank again Suzano Pulp and Paper Industry, which is our sponsor, and thanks to them, thanks to Suzano, we are able to have this webinar today. Arthur Krober is certainly one of the most competent sinologists that I have seen in my life. I met him when I was ambassador to China. Some 15 years ago was the beginning of my involvement with China, and my involvement also with Arthur and Gavecal, which is a very competent think tank about China. The theme today is how China will navigate global storms. We are taking into consideration the fact that our background is the fact that we are going through a transition of international order. We have lived for more than half a century an order based on the Cold War, an order which emerged with the Allied victory in World War II, and then began the East-West conflict. On the one side, we had a power pole in the Soviet Union, on the other side, the one led by the United States of America. The Cold War is over, the Soviet Union is over, and then we are in a new era whose outline are not yet very clear. But I would remember, and I would cite a book by Doris Kearns Goodwin about the Roosevelts. And I remember a speech by Eleanor Roosevelt in 1940, when for the first time in American history, a president would seek the 3rd mandate. And she said, as a justification for that we are living no ordinary time. And I think that today we are also living a no ordinary time. We are changing an international order. We don't know how it will be, the new one, but certainly some facts are very important, like the emergence of China. And I would be more comprehensive. I would mention the emergence of Asia as a more important pole of power in the new order, in the order which is being formed. I would mention the fact that the new order can be defined by either by a conceptual neutrality, a balance of power. So it was the Pax Britannica, for instance, an engaged conceptual order. The strongest more impose their order to the rest. An idealistic one, conceptually based on the architecture of most multilateral governance organizations. But perhaps the most important fact that we have nowadays is instability. We are surging with new sorts of conflicts that we are not prepared to deal with. And the war in Ukraine is a very good demonstration of that. We obviously, it seems to be obvious that Putin did make a strategic mistake in invading Ukraine, and the West does not know how to react to this invasion. So therefore, there are a number of variables, much more, an increased number of variables in today's crisis, but the main background is instability, is a change of international order. But to speak about that, I would pass the floor to Arthur and wish him well. Arthur, you have the floor. Thank you very much for being with us.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Those really terrific framing remarks, Ambassador Castro-Nieves, and thank you, Julia and Claudia, for welcoming me back. I am indeed very sorry that this still has to be done remotely, but I'm looking forward to coming back to Brazil in person next year and resuming the dialogue that I have with many of you. So I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to share some thoughts and have some discussion with you about what the ambassador has, I think, rightly characterized as a very uncertain, fluid time. And basically, my objective is to present to you how this uncertain and fluid time looks from the perspective of China and what strategic calculations they are making in order to position China from their point of view properly in this new global situation. So I'm going to start with that, with a discussion of how China is handling the immediate geopolitical crisis of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and try to locate that in the larger issues relating to China's position in the world and its relationship with the United States. And then I will move in the second half of my presentation, I'll move into a discussion of what's going on within China today, because we also have a fairly volatile and uncertain economic picture in China, which is going to, I think, constrain or influence the way that they interact with the rest of the world. And so hopefully I'll deal with that in about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we can open it up for your questions and comments. So let me just share my presentation here. Okay, so as I mentioned, the main topics I want to address are China's positioning and reaction relative to the Ukraine crisis, its wider global positioning, which has a lot to do with its relationship with the United States, and then a consideration of some of the macroeconomic variables. And the short version of the last point is it's going to be a very, very difficult year for China's economy. They have a lot of problems. And so I think we have to anticipate that growth in China is going to be fairly weak this year. If you take a longer term view, I think it's more mixed. And Xi Jinping certainly has a very strong view of where he wants to take China. But I think the question is, how many other people within the system actually are on board with his agenda? And there are certainly, I think, some clearly dissenting voices. And I've been back to China twice during COVID, for a couple months at the end of 2020, and then again for a couple months at the end of last year. And what was noticeable in my most recent trip was that there was more open and vocal criticism of the way Xi Jinping was managing the country and managing the economy from people in what you might call the technocratic class. So a very live discussion going on in China today about what's the appropriate direction. But let's start, as I promised, with a discussion of what's going on in Ukraine. And I think the key point that it's really important to stress, there's been a lot of speculation about, how closely is China aligned with Russia? How much did they know about the invasion before it happened? And I think we can be pretty clear on 2 points. Number one is there's just no ambiguity in my mind about the strategic alignment that Xi Jinping has set up between China and Russia. This is a core part of Xi's foreign policy strategy, that there needs to be closer relations with Russia and that they should jointly advance some of their shared interests. And I think, as probably most of you know, there was a statement put out by the two leaders on February 4th when Putin came for the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics in Beijing. And it was a very sort of bombastic statement. It claimed that there are no limits to the friendship between the two countries, and there are no forbidden zones and so forth. So it had this very exaggerated rhetoric about how close they were. And I think we need to be careful to not take the rhetorical part of that statement too seriously, but at the same time recognize that the underlying strategic alignment is very strong. And we can see this if we look back over the last 10 years of Sino-Russian relations. There has been a very clear movement to getting closer and to resolving some of their differences and increasing the areas of shared interest. And you can see this by the sheer fact that Xi Jinping and Putin have now met 38 times since Xi became the leader of China. That is by far the largest number of personal interactions that Xi has had with any other foreign leader. So the personal relationship is very close. If you look at a lot of the traditional sources of friction and tension between the two countries, both leaders have worked, I think, quite assiduously to calm those down. The increase in their economic relationships through trade, and particularly natural resources, has been very steady. So this is a clear alignment, and I think it is based on some calculations by the Chinese leadership. And this is not Xi Jinping himself alone, but I think his circle around him. As I've highlighted here, they have two core beliefs that govern their strategic calculations. And number one is that they are convinced that the United States is essentially hostile and essentially wants to contain China and keep it down and retard its development and prevent China from gaining any more global influence. This is their belief. I think it's very strongly held, and it's very strongly held among a large proportion of serious people in the Chinese foreign policy establishment. Second belief is that the US is in decline, and they have looked at the last several years where the US has had a lot of social conflicts, had a great deal of difficulty in managing the COVID epidemic. They look at Black Lives Matter and all of the often violent debates that we're having in the United States now over racial politics and the organization of society. And they see a country that is fragmented, very challenged in terms of keeping itself together. And they also believe that the US is not really going to be able to sustain the kinds of alliances that it has done traditionally. So the US is a somewhat hostile adversary set on containing China, and it is in decline. Therefore, it makes sense for China to forge relationships with other countries that share an interest in taking advantage of this US decline and in pushing back against US efforts to continue to exert control over the global system. And that's where the overlap in Chinese and Russian interests is very strong. Now, I'll make one side comment here, which is that I think if you look at the nature of the Chinese and the Russian systems and the way that they interact with the global order, they're very different. So Russia under Putin has been what you could call a mischievous power. They're interested in creating disruption. You know, their integration with the global economy is largely through resources. It is not through other forms of trade and investment. And so Russia does seem to have some pretty strongly destabilizing tendencies. China is not interested in being a destabilizer. And this, I think, is one of the things that makes their position complicated. They don't like a lot of aspects of the current global order. They think the US has too much power. They would like China to have too much power. They want to have their system recognized as legitimate. They want to extend more influence, but they want these changes to occur without fundamentally destabilizing the global order because they derive enormous economic benefits from that. So China, in a certain sense, is a more complicated task, is that they need to continue integrating with the global order, but at the same time changing it and shifting its parameters. So they're not deliberately destabilizing, but clearly from the perspective of others, there are certain destabilizing aspects to the way China is approaching things. So that is, I think, the fundamental bet that Xi Jinping has made. He's made a bet on what the US is and where it's headed. And then he's made a bet that it makes sense strategically for China to align itself with Russia as a major global resource economy that has a shared interest in shifting the boundaries and the rules of the game in the global order. Now, having done that, you know, I think there's a lot of speculation that when Putin came to Beijing, he shared with Xi his full plans with regard to Ukraine. Most of the people that I've talked to in China or close to the Chinese system think that that's very improbable, that it is not likely that Xi would have simply signed off on a plan of invasion that was as dramatic as Putin launched on February 24th. And again, this gets back to the point that China wants to shift the global order, but they're not interested in being obviously disruptive. And clearly what Putin has done is obviously disruptive. So this has put, I think, China in a difficult position, that they signed this very flowing statement about, you know, the unlimited potential of the China-Russia partnership. They probably did so with a very limited understanding of what Putin was planning to do in Ukraine. And so when he invaded Ukraine 3 weeks later, it sort of made them look like they had somehow authorized or given active support to this particular move. And that may not be true, but it's very difficult for China to push back against that perception. So they are in a very uncomfortable position of having to maintain the alignment with Russia, while at the same time maintaining their overall foreign policy position, which is predicated on the notion that national sovereignty is a paramount virtue and is unassailable. And clearly Putin has completely broken that by invading Ukraine. So that puts China in a very difficult position. I think that sometimes the Western media coverage of this overstates the degree of discomfort that the Chinese leadership feels with this. I think it is a difficult situation, but I think it is one that they are prepared to manage. And the key task that they have is to maintain normal commercial relations with Russia to the extent that they can, but not do anything that will trigger secondary sanctions from the United States and Europe. So they have to thread that needle. So far, they've done that very successfully. Chinese companies are complying with the sanctions. They are not selling goods to sanctioned entities. They've been very forthright in asking the US and European authorities for guidance on what they need to do in order to comply with sanctions. So I think it's pretty clear that the Chinese will not do anything that triggers sanctions activity by the United States or Europe. And that applies both to commercial activities and to sales of weapons. I don't really see any evidence at the moment that China has an interest in selling military equipment to Russia. Obviously, that's very difficult to track. And it's easy to be wrong on that, but it's hard to see why that would be in their interest. I think they do want to maintain a situation where they are not drawn into this wider sanctions net. I think it's also important to recognize that China probably calculates that it will come out ahead regardless of the outcome in Ukraine. So clearly, if Russia succeeds in some kind of objective in Ukraine, for example, by dividing the country, turning the eastern part of Ukraine into some kind of Russian-dominated breakaway state or something like that, if that agenda is advanced, then I think China would view that as something of a success in pushing back against the US-led order. But if Russia fails and winds up in a situation where it's just very economically isolated and it hasn't really achieved any of its strategic aims in Ukraine, that is not necessarily a loss for China either, because one of their aims in the alignment with Russia is to have essentially a client state. And if Russia is weaker in its relationship with Europe and the US, then it has to invest more in its relationship with China, and that's a benefit to China. We have one very specific example of how this might work. So if you look back to 2014, after Russia invaded Crimea, or annexed Crimea, the West put a lot of sanctions on Russia. And this changed the negotiations over a major pipeline between Siberia and China. So they had been negotiating for 10 years a gas pipeline, and Putin for years had wanted to have that pipeline essentially have two channels, one channel going to China and another going to Europe, because he didn't want to be locked into one buyer. But the Chinese wanted a dedicated pipeline that came only to them, because that would give them more leverage. So they had been negotiating this pipeline for many years and had not been able to agree. After the Crimea sanctions went into place, Putin was in a much weaker position. And so the Chinese were able to negotiate the dedicated pipeline that they wanted. And they were also able to negotiate a very favorable price on the gas, much cheaper, as far as anyone knows, than the gas that Russia sells to Germany. So again, to the degree that China depends on Russia as a supplier of key natural resources, if Russia is in a somewhat weaker position and that enables China to create more favorable terms, that's a benefit for them. So I think there maybe are situations where China comes out as a loser, but I think from their perspective, it is what they would like to call a win-win situation, where China winds up winning in some way, regardless of the outcome. So a couple of other aspects of this, and then I'll move on. I think from the Chinese perspective, I think there are people in the system who've recognized that the Ukraine situation has created a bad outcome from China's perspective, which is that it has solidified the US-NATO alliance. The European response to Ukraine has been very strong, much stronger than anyone expected. I think Europe has taken the view that this invasion poses an existential risk to Europe, and so therefore they're going to invest a lot more in their military. They're going to invest much more in energy independence, and the solidity of the US-European alliance based around common values of liberal societies and democratic politics. This has been reaffirmed. And it's also notable that US allies in Asia, notably Japan, Australia, and Singapore, have also joined in the sanctions. So this, I think, cuts at the core belief that I mentioned above in Chinese elite circles that the US is in decline and that its alliances are fraying. I think we've seen exactly the opposite. And so this is, I think, going to be an important constraint on China's global activity. They're going to have to deal with a US, European, and to some extent US Asian alliance network that has been revitalized and is much, much stronger than in the past. I think against this, the calculation of the Chinese government is that US, European, and other developed countries, companies depend increasingly on the Chinese market. And so it will be much more difficult for a US-led alliance to do things to constrain or sanction China because their companies are really dependent on the market. And I think that's where we're in right now, and I'll get back to this when I discuss US-China relations, is that at the security or political level, there clearly is a much more adversarial relationship. But the economic linkages between China and the developed world are very deep, much deeper than Russia's, very complicated. And so how do you manage this combination of the tense security political relationship with a deeply integrated economic relationship? And then the final comment I'll make here is that there's been a lot of discussion about maybe China could, create payment systems that would enable them to do business with Russia or other countries and avoid the US dollar payment system and thereby avoid US sanctions. I really just don't take these very seriously. The inertia and the network effects undergirding the current US dollar oriented global financial system are very powerful. And China basically has been trying for a long time to create some alternatives with essentially no success. And the reason that they're not successful is that they are too determined to maintain controls on capital flows in and out of China. And the reason for that is that they think if they completely deregulate capital flows, they will lose control of the domestic financial system, and that this will be very bad for the domestic economy. So their desire to maintain domestic stability at all costs, importantly financial stability, acts, I think, as a binding constraint on their ability to create any kind of meaningful alternative to the global system financially. So yes, there's more incentives for China and Russia to cook up ways to create an economic and financial system that is resistant to US pressure, but the practical obstacles to creating that system remain immense, and there are a lot of unsolved problems there. So I've spent a lot of time on this, but I think it is important to understand as clearly as we can China's strategic calculations in relation to the current crisis. Okay, let's move on. I think if we just look at some of the implications of what's going on in the short term, I think the main risk that China faces from this whole situation is that they have relied a lot on export growth to power their economy for the last few years. And now with global economic growth probably going to be a lot slower as a result of this crisis. Inflation will be higher. That means central bank policy will be much tighter. I think this is going to translate into slower export growth for China, some pressure on capital outflows as the US raises interest rates. And so essentially, I think what this does is it complicates the economic equation for China in the short term. They've got a very difficult this year, and I think the Ukraine situation makes it significantly worse at the margin. So that's the short-term issue. And the long-term issue, as I've already explained, I think the basic question is, China has made a big bet on its relationship with Russia. I think they have cogent reasons for doing that, but you can also see that this might be a strategic error. And I think we're just going to have to wait and see over the next several years how that plays out. Okay, so I want to now talk a little bit about the relationship with the United States. And this is a somewhat complicated map that I've set up of, in the United States, how people look at China and what impact this has. So just briefly to explain, I think there are four broad interest groups, which you see on the left here. And the first two are very prominent under Trump. There are economic nationalists who want to bring a lot of manufacturing and other activity back to the United States, and they want to pursue a very unilateralist economic policy. They're not very interested in multilateral institutions or trade agreements. And then there are also people in the national security system who see China as a technological and military threat. And I think basically what happened under the Trump administration is that the views of those interest groups became very powerful, and Trump reconfigured the basic view in the US towards China from what used to be called constructive engagement to strategic competition. And Biden has basically accepted this, right? So this is now a permanent change. You've had both parties sort of accept, yes, we are now in a strategic competition with China. That is the basic framework. So that was, I think, a permanent achievement of the Trump administration. And if you look at what Biden has done in his China policy in the first year and a half of his administration, he basically hasn't changed anything. He hasn't done a lot to escalate the competition or the rivalry, but he has basically left everything in place. He has added an element of the rivalry, and this is what I label the values coalition at the bottom. And basically this is people who care about human rights and the fact that China fundamentally has a non-democratic system, and the view is that the US should not, have good relations with large countries that have non-democratic systems, right? And Biden has really amplified this through his concept of a competition between democracies and autocracies. And that was not something that Trump did. This is sort of an additional feature of the Biden strategy. And against this, you have businesses which have enormous stakes in China, viewed as a major growing market, as a really essential production base, and as a core to their global strategies. So the basic problem that the US faces is that you have a lot of reasons for wanting to have a more rivalrous relationship with China relating to economic nationalism and national security and values and so forth. But you have a lot of economic interests that are very powerful. And so what I see emerging over the next decade is this continuous tug of war between the sort of anti-China interests, or the security interests that are trying to pull the two economies apart, and the business interests that say, no, we just can't afford to. It's important to keep the integration going. And so what I think you're going to see is some degree of what we call decoupling, but it's going to be here and there. It's not comprehensive. And the business interests are going to be a pretty important constraint on the ability of any American administration to pull things apart. And you can just see this in the degree of reliance that US companies have on the China market. In this chart, if you look at the blue line, that is the sales in China of US companies and their subsidiaries based on domestic production. And if you look at the black line below that, that's the exports that go from the US to China. And you can see the export numbers are, have been pretty big, right? They're almost $200 billion. But the sales of US companies in China are 3 times as large and continuing to grow very fast. The data we get on this is with something of a lag, but the last couple of years actually have been very, very good years for US companies in China. So when you go to them and say, well, for national security reasons or whatever, you should move out of China, they say, we can't afford to. This makes no sense from the standpoint of the interests of our shareholders. So that's, I think, getting back to Ambassador Castronevi's point that the outlines of the emerging global order are very blurry. I totally agree with that. And this is a big reason why you have this massive contradiction in the United States between what you could call a security agenda that says we need to pull apart from China, and this economic and business agenda, which says we absolutely cannot afford to pull apart from China. There's too much going on. There's too much benefit from that relationship. And it's very difficult to know how that how that conflict is going to work out. I just want to conclude this part with a couple of observations on what we might expect from U.S. policy. As I mentioned, essentially, Biden has accepted the framework of strategic competition that he inherited for Trump. He really hasn't changed that a lot. He hasn't thrown on new tariffs. He's expanded some economic sanctions a little bit, but it's been very minor. But he also hasn't taken anything away, right? So I think the main things that we can look for in the remainder of this year is, I think it is quite likely that we will see a new, what they call a Section 301 trade action against China. So Section 301 of the US trade law is what was done in the Trump administration to justify a lot of the tariffs that were put on China. And then there was a phase one trade deal. And basically what happened in that trade deal was that China did not succeed in making all of the purchases of US goods that they were required to under that trade deal. And so now the US is left with the question like, okay, that trade deal didn't work. What do we do about it? And I think a reaction is that there will be a new Section 301 action. I would stress, though, that this is likely to be somewhat technical, because I think what the US Trade Representative wants to do is not increase the number of tariffs that there are in China, but rearrange the goods that are tariffed. And for technical reasons, the only way that they can do that, if they want to take tariffs off of some goods and then impose them on new ones, they have to launch a whole new action. So this will be, I think, viewed as kind of a hostile action by China, but it will also be somewhat technical in nature. So I think that's something we are likely to see. The other thing that I'm looking for is that there's some legislation in Congress which is sort of couched as, the US needs to compete with China, and so here's how we're going to do it, right? And so there are two different bills. They are both mainly about massively increasing investments in US technology and research and development. And a lot of it has to do with investments in semiconductors. They also contain some elements of things that would, potentially restrict trade and investment with China. So I'm waiting to see whether these bills will be reconciled and, pulled into one thing. I think it's pretty likely that they will be, but we don't know what the parameters of those will be. But again, these are less, although they're sort of presented in terms of being anti-China, they're really about domestic investments, right? So I think in terms of substantively, are we going to see things in the next year or so that change the rules of the game for trade and investment flows between the US and China? I think the answer is basically no, not that much. However, next year we could see a lot more. We're expecting that the Congress will pass over into Republican hands, almost certainly the House, possibly the Senate. And if we see a Republican Congress, I think it's much more likely to be hawkish on China. And the main thing that we could see, which I've highlighted here on the bottom, is the establishment of a screening mechanism for outbound investment, right? And this would make the US the first country in the world to set up a mechanism for policing international investments by its companies. As you know, there's already a mechanism called CFIUS that we have for reviewing inbound direct investments in the United States for national security concerns. But there is no complementary mechanism for governing the investments by US companies in the rest of the world. And again, this would mainly focus on investments in China. Initially, I think this would focus only on direct investments. So, if you're a company that wants to set up a factory in China, you might have to get approval for that. It would not affect, financial flows by investment companies that just want to buy Chinese stocks and bonds, but we could get there. So I think the main thing that we want to look for is, are we going to see more restrictions on the ability of capital to move from the United States and potentially from other countries to China? And I think it's quite likely that we'll see some restrictions there. The question is, how stiff are those restrictions? Okay, so that is my overall view of geopolitical situation, China's position in it, and the evolution in the relationship with the United States. I want to conclude now with a few minutes about the Chinese domestic situation. And, as an economist, I will look at it mainly economically, but I will preface these remarks by observing that we are at a pretty interesting moment in the Chinese political calendar. As I'm sure most of you know, Xi Jinping is coming up on, completing 10 years at the head of the Chinese Communist Party. And, the norm that had been established by Deng Xiaoping in the early 1990s was that a leader should have 2 5-year terms, and that was it. And Xi Jinping obviously has amended the constitution to permit him essentially to stay in power for as long as he wants. And so the first test of this will be at the party congress that we're going to have in October or November of this year, where he will be going for a 3rd term as the head of state and as the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think the assumption has been that his political position was strong enough that this would be no problem for him to get that. I think that is still basically the assumption, that there are a lot of dissatisfactions in various parts of the system with his leadership, but there is no effective political opposition to him. And so most likely he will get a 3rd term. It will be an interesting question. There will also be turnover in the Politburo and the Standing Committee, and I think there are some questions about, who will get in, and will that the choice of those people, will that reflect some constraints on his power? A little bit hard to predict that at the moment. However, I think there's a little bit more doubt about his position now than there would have been a couple of months ago for 2 reasons. One is there's a lot of people in China, I think, clearly, who believe that this alignment with Russia is a big mistake. It's a strategic error, that China's long-term interests are better served by figuring out how to integrate with the global order, not with aligning itself with what's now become essentially a rogue regime. So there's, I think, a lot of concern that there's just been a very basic strategic foreign policy mistake that has been made. There's also a lot of discontent about the way the economy has been managed over the last year. And when I was in Beijing in December, several people remarked to me that they thought there was too much political interference, that this was causing problems in the economy, and that it was important for management of the economy to be put back in the hands of the technocrats, right? And I think there's a lot of pressure right now, and the issues relate to the crackdown on internet firms, which is viewed as an assault on one of the most important dynamic private sector areas of the economy. We've seen the COVID-0 policy, which is now becoming very difficult to manage with the Omicron variant, which spreads a lot more quickly. So now you're seeing increased lockdowns, and this is going to, have negative impact for, China's consumer spending and so forth. So there's a lot of concern that Xi Jinping's political objectives have started to interfere with the good functioning of the Chinese economy. So I think there's an interesting question about how much are Xi's mistakes, both in foreign policy and in domestic economic management, going to cause trouble for him in October. We don't know, and my bet would still be he gets his 3rd term. But I think this is a slightly more doubtful outcome than we would have thought a couple months ago. So let me talk a little bit about the structural situation in the economy. And I think basically the problem that China faces is you look at every single element of the economy, and every single element of the economy has massive problems. So this is going to be quite a difficult year. The government set a target of 5.5% GDP growth. I think that's going to be very difficult to achieve. I think the only way that they can achieve that is by, essentially lying about the numbers. I think in reality, economic growth this year will be below 5%. And there's a question of, what is the composition of that? And right now, as of this quarter, probably quarter on quarter, the growth is about zero. So it is an economy that's facing big problems. So I'm just going to run through the big problems. And the big problems are problems not just for this year, but also for out years. So the biggest one is property. China has had essentially a 20-year boom in its property market, and this is indicated by the red line, which is the sales of urban housing. And you can see there have been some ups and downs, but basically it's been an upward path for 20 years. And what I've circled is every time we've had a number of downturns, but every time you had a downturn, you see there was a very big bounce back and a rebound. And we don't think that's going to happen this time. We think that we are now on a plateau at best, where annual sales of housing are not going to increase in a structural way, and probably over the course of the next several years, they're going to go down. So instead of being on a steady upward curve with some ups and downs, you're now at best on a plateau and maybe on a downward slope. And that's going to create a lot of difficulties. Directly and indirectly, the property sector accounts for something like a quarter of China's GDP growth. If its contribution goes to zero, which is essentially what we're talking about, that means that they lose 1.5 points or more of GDP growth. So your GDP growth goes from whatever 6% automatically down to 4 or 4.5%, simply because the property sector is no longer a positive contributor. So that's a major problem, both in terms of the short-term management and in terms of what they do for the next several years. Second, and this is, I think, a little bit more of a short-term problem, but it's a big one. The COVID has become a big problem. They've had a zero COVID strategy for a long time. This worked pretty well, but now with Omicron, it basically is not tenable. So on the top here, I've indicated the number of cases. You see it's gone up quite a lot. There was an initial outbreak in the Northeast, which is in blue, and you can see this was initially half of or more of the cases. It's now a small minority, and the cases are growing, notably in Shanghai, but in other places as well. And so we're seeing lockdowns, and what that is doing is it's going to be very bad for consumer activity. So this is a measure of travel, essentially traffic congestion. You can see in the first COVID year of 2020, when they had massive lockdowns, domestic traffic, plummeted, it crept back up. Then 2021, the black line was back up to normal, but 2022, it's a lot worse. And I think it's going to get worse in the coming months. And this is a proxy for all kinds of consumer activity. If you can't go out, you can't spend money, you can't go to restaurants and so forth. And in Shanghai, they're even having problems ordering food online because so many people have been locked down that all the food ordering apps have crashed. So consumer activity, I think, is going to be very, very weak for the next 2 months until they get this COVID outbreak under control. And I think they are probably going to have to look at some way of moving away from a COVID zero to a more of a management strategy, but it's going to take them a long time to do that. The other thing that we're concerned about is that this could also affect the supply side of the economy, which it really didn't do before that much. But what you can see here is that the throughput of major, cargo centers is a lot lower now than it was a year ago. And in a world that is beset by supply chain woes and not being able to not get enough goods, and resulting inflationary pressures, the fact that China is having problems getting its goods out to market, I think, is an additional problem. So this is a problem not just for China, but it's also a problem for the rest of the world. So fundamentally, what I see from this is lower consumer spending, lower growth in China, and probably more inflationary pressure on the rest of the world. Third problem is that there's a lot of, there was this massive crackdown on the Chinese technology sector, which is one of the most vibrant private sector parts of the economy. These are the stock prices of all of the major Chinese tech firms. You can see that they've basically collapsed by somewhere between, 40 to 80% since the peak at the beginning of 2021. And I think the broader concern that people have is that this may dent overall business confidence in China. There's this view that maybe the government just doesn't want the private sector anymore. And so if you're a private entrepreneur, what space is there for you? So they have to do something to revive confidence. And then the final constraint that I say, and this is much more of a structural one, is China's debt situation. And the point here is simply that China has pretty high debt relative to economies of a similar level of income. Those are the emerging economies in blue that I've outlined here, right? It's not actually that high compared to advanced economies. But what it does mean is that as China wants to move into this group of high-income economies, they have to do that without increasing leverage. So policy is constrained by the fact that they need to stimulate the economy, but they can't stimulate it too much using debt because that will move them into an unsustainable leverage situation. So fundamentally, when we look at the short-term situation, I don't think that they're going to hit their growth target. I think there are too many negatives. They're going to do more fiscal stimulus on infrastructure, which they can do because they have a lot of money saved up, but they can't do much monetary stimulus through credit. And if you want one indicator to follow to understand the trajectory of the Chinese economy this year, probably what you want to do is look at flows of credit to the property sector, which have not actually been all that strong. So just a few things to illustrate this. This is the fiscal situation. So you can see a big fiscal impulse, mainly through the blue, which is saved up reserves, not sort of new borrowing. So that's pretty important. But if you look at credit growth, and look over at the right-hand side here, it's pretty weak. We've not seen a big increase in credit, and that reflects the fact that they just don't feel that they can accelerate credit growth that much. I think what I want to leave you with is, where does China see itself going long-term, and what are the problems? And this is what the strategy is. So they've got a very short-term set of economic problems they need to manage, which also reflect long-term issues in kind of rebalancing the economy away from reliance on property. And they have a geopolitical situation where they are viewing themselves as more in a competition with the US, and so they need to be more self-reliant in everything. And so what I've summarized here is Xi Jinping's view of how you do this. So number one is you have much tighter governance. And he has all of these slogans: rule of law, common prosperity, dual circulation, et cetera. Probably the most important of these at the moment is dual circulation. And what this means is an economy that continues to benefit from so-called external circulation, that is to say exports and foreign investment, but is increasingly reliant on domestic circulation. That's the second of the two dual circulations. And really what this is about is self-reliance in technology, because China still imports a lot of technology from the United States. They feel that's going to be, and United States allies, that's going to be harder to do in future, so they need to be more self-reliant, right? And I think that the fundamental question is, China has relied for its economic growth on having a globally integrated economy. Can they become a more self-enclosed, domestically oriented economy and still maintain that vibrant growth? I think that's a big question mark. And I've summarized here, I think the concept that the Chinese leadership has of how they do it, they call it the innovation-driven economy. I call it the venture capitalist state, where the state acts as this sort of mobilizer of funds and throws a huge amount of money into high-tech growth sectors. And the implicit idea here is that you'll get enough growth out of these new high-tech sectors that will replace the growth that you're losing from the property sector. And so you move to being a more high-tech, innovative economy. And I guess, again, the question is, can you do this without being globally integrated? Can you do this simply by being a domestically oriented economy? And I think it's very difficult, because I think the nature of technology now is that it depends on sharing of ideas across a large number of regions. So I think this is kind of the dilemma that China faces. They have a short-term growth problem and a long-term growth problem. To manage the long-term growth problem, they need to get more innovation and more productive investment. They have a plan for doing this, but I'm not sure that that plan will work out. So where I'll leave you is, I think there are a couple of scenarios for China. The successful one is what I call Leninist Germany, where they succeed in all of this venture capital investment. They develop a lot of new technology sectors. Growth slows, but it's still relatively fast, and they don't increase their debt. And this solidifies the authoritarian state because it was successful in creating this. I think the risk, on the other hand, which is growing, is that it becomes a more stagnant economy where they don't get enough productivity growth. They're investing too much in low return things, and they're cutting themselves off from the global economy in important ways. And then this causes them to become a much, much lower growth economy, and consequently a much less, I think, aggressive actor globally. Those are the two possibilities. Truth will probably lie somewhere in between. Hard to say, as Ambassador Castroneves said, the outlines of what's coming are somewhat blurry, but I hope that these comments have been useful in helping you think through some of the potential implications of where China is and where it's going. So I'll leave it there and hand it back to Claudia to guide the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arthur. It was a terrific presentation. You covered a lot of ground, and you have many things to talk in our discussion. I know that you value a lot the interaction with our audience, so I'm going straight to their questions. And the first block of questions, they touch the issue of China-Russia relationship. And the first one is from Mr. Nicholas Lard, who is also a global authority on Chinese economy. If Russia loses, it may not be a loss for China, as you state, but wouldn't it be a loss personally for Xi? And we have two other questions. That is there a possibility of Xi abandoning Putin if the situation in Russia gets worse? And what are the bilateral issues in the China-Russia relationship that have the potential to derail this partnership?
Yeah. So just on the question, no, I don't think that there's really any likelihood that Xi will abandon Putin. There's just too much at stake. Clearly, as I mentioned, they forged this apparently very intense personal relationship. The strategic calculations at the top level about why Russia and China need to align seem to me too powerful. And there's just a lot at stake. So the question is, how do you maintain that alignment without causing too many problems elsewhere? I think that's the goal. And as I've indicated, and it's been very clear by stuff that's popped up on the internet, there are a lot of dissenting voices in China. I mean, there are plenty of people within the party state who would say this makes no sense. China's core interest actually lies in cementing its relationships with the global economic order on which it depends. It's not like this is a unanimous view, but it does seem that is the central view of the leadership. And as to Nick's question, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think obviously the discussions within the Chinese political system are very opaque, and so we have to do a lot of speculation. But my impression is that if Russia suffers a really serious reversal, this is clearly bad for Xi. I mean, I think the outcome of this has already been bad for Xi in terms of his political standing, because China made a very dramatic statement of support for Russia 3 weeks ahead of a pretty extraordinary adventure by Russia that directly goes against one of the core stated principles of Chinese foreign policy, which is the sacredness of sovereignty. So it's put them in a very difficult place. And I think, as I mentioned, I think this is one of the things that has people speculating that maybe it won't be possible for Xi to get as much as he wants in the next Party Congress, because this will have been viewed as such an error. I think the only way we have of knowing whether that's the case or not is when we get to the Party Congress and see what happens, both in terms of his third term, and I think perhaps more importantly, what the composition of the personnel on the new Politburo and Standing Committee is. So yes, I think it's clearly bad for Xi politically. At the moment, it doesn't seem to me that it's bad enough to cause him, irreparable damage. And sorry, Claudia, the other questions at the end, can you?
Whether the issues on the bilateral relationship between China and Russia that have the potential to derail this partnership.
Yeah, if we looked at my colleagues and I looked at this pretty carefully, and if you look at sort of the trajectory of China-Russia relations over the past decade, it's a very steady trend of convergence. This is not something where Xi Jinping snapped his fingers and said, we're going to line up with these guys. You've seen a very steady, particularly on the Russian side, they had a lot of concerns previously about things like, Chinese takeover, stealth takeover of the Russian Far East and so forth. They had a lot of anxiety about that. And there seems to have been a deliberate effort on the Russian side to downplay these concerns and focus on the positives. So, and I think from the Chinese perspective, as usually, they view these things in fairly transactional terms. That they are not. It's important to point out that they are not in an alliance with Russia. They do not have an obligation to defend Russia from attack. There's no clear military treaty component to this. This is like a convergence of interests, and China clearly has massive interests in being able to continue to rely on natural resources from Russia at prices and through mechanisms that are helpful to them. And anything that get out of Russia in terms of oil, gas, or anything else has the advantage that it comes overland in areas that the United States is not able to interdict. So strategically, as a kind of a resource hinterland, Russia, I think, is extraordinarily valuable for China, and they will continue to take maximum advantage of that, regardless of how Russia's standing in the world continues to evolve.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Arthur. The other question is about Chinese investments abroad. You're talking about this inward-looking of China, this search for more self-reliance. How this would affect the Chinese investments abroad, and which areas China will continue to invest abroad? And the same question also asks why China is facing this new wave of COVID. Is a problem with the vaccination that they are using?
Right. Okay, so on the investment abroad, if you look at the numbers, so we track several different series that indicate this. One is outward direct investment. And what you can see is that this peaked about 4 years ago, declined, and is now sort of steady at a significant, but significantly lower level, right? And I think what this reflects is, number one, the recognition that sort of the ability of the rest of the world to absorb what we would call Belt and Road investments, so these investments in resources and infrastructure, particularly in the developing world. The ability of the developing world to absorb those is limited, right? And there were just a lot of projects that didn't work out very well, or didn't deliver the desired returns, or created certain kinds of political blowback. So they've become somewhat more selective in those kinds of investments, and a little bit more focused on the returns. This is also reflected, another series we follow is the overseas revenues of Chinese construction and engineering firms, and these peaked about 2.5 years ago and have come down a bit after, basically 20 years of steady rise. So this shows that the activity of Chinese firms, again, in these sort of Belt and Road related things, it's leveled off. And I think that the primary thing that's going on there is just a recognition that there are only so many bankable projects out there. So I think China's outward investment in that domain, infrastructure and resources, has hit a natural limit. It's not going away. They clearly have interests in doing this, both in terms of securing resources, finding business for their firms, and increasing their influence globally. But you're not going to see a lot of growth there. I think the other element of foreign direct investment is that you saw a huge boom in 2014, 2015, a lot of which was M&A activity, much of it focused on sort of technology assets in the developing world. And the door is basically shut on that. So the US now has rules that have effectively brought Chinese investment in the US tech sector down to zero. Europe has been a little bit behind that, but is effectively doing much of the same thing. So the ability of Chinese companies to invest in technology assets internationally is very constrained. And then finally, I think you had some elements of the outbound direct investment that were essentially capital flight, and they've put in capital controls to try and restrict that. So in terms of what we see in the future, they continue to have, I think, structural interests, as I mentioned, in sort of infrastructure and research assets globally, but these are, I think, now constrained by the realities of how many of these projects can actually generate a decent return. They have an interest in market access or technology investments in the rest of the world, but these are now constrained in the most attractive markets, right? So will China continue to be a major outbound investor? Yes, because they have a lot of money to spend. Are we going to see much growth in that? I think the answer is no. And I think the question then is, do we see an improvement in the, if you will, the quality and the governance of some of these projects or not? And I think there are a lot of problems there. I think the other element of this that I didn't touch on was lending. The lending data, external lending data, are a little bit difficult to read because I think they include some transactions between China and Hong Kong that don't actually reflect global lending. But again, we've seen some constraints. So if you look at the latest reports from the Export-Import Bank of China, which was one of the big funders of Belt and Road projects, they've had a shift away from international projects to domestic projects, because as a policy bank, they are sort of governed by the political demands of where they're supposed to put their money. So again, I think this reflects that there's an increasing constraint as China is facing a more difficult growth environment at home. They have a little bit less ability to simply finance all kinds of projects internationally. And so at the margin, you're probably likely to see somewhat lesser credit flows externally. So China remains an important investor globally, I think, in a lot of the traditional sectors that we're used to seeing them. But their ability to continue expanding that profile, I think, is a lot weaker. On COVID, I think basically what happened is that, Omicron is just a much, much, much more transmissible variant, right? So all the prior variants of COVID could be contained if you had very strict border controls and pretty tight containment policies, tracking policies where you tested a lot of people and then restricted people's movements and so forth. You could basically get things under control. But I think what every country in the world has now discovered is that trying to contain Omicron in this way is just impossible, right? And so every other country that had some version of a zero COVID policy is now retreating from that into a managed COVID approach. and China is trying to hold the line and have a very, very draconian approach. And I think the reason that they're doing that is that they are concerned that if they just try to manage it and have a somewhat more relaxed policy, that the strain on their healthcare system will just be too strong, right? So there are concerns about the quality of the Chinese vaccines, which are a little hard to judge. But what the Chinese health officials have said is that vaccination rates among older populations are relatively low. So if you had more widespread COVID, you would have a lot of older people getting very sick and probably dying, and that this would create a lot of pressure on the domestic healthcare system. You've seen this in miniature in Hong Kong, which has had a dramatic outbreak, very badly managed. But the big problem there is that the healthcare system got overwhelmed by the fact that old people were basically not vaccinated, so they were very, very vulnerable. So the Chinese are in kind of a bind. I think they're right to be concerned that they simply can't move to a more relaxed, let's manage COVID policy, because their healthcare system is not robust enough to manage that. But I think they're also in a position where the only way to contain it now is through these much more draconian lockdowns, which have a much more severe economic impact. And I don't think they've figured out how to balance that. So there are some signs. So one of my analysts tracks this. The situation in Shanghai is very bad. If you look at most of the other cities that have had outbreaks, they seem to have done a better job of containing them. So maybe Shanghai is a unique problem. I think the concern there is that enough people were able to travel outside of Shanghai before the current lockdowns that other outbreaks in the rest of the country have probably been seeded, and it may just not be possible to control. So I'm pretty negative, certainly in terms of the impact on the economy this year, because I think they're likely to be battling quite significant outbreaks for most of the year based on the transmissibility of the virus and their concerns about that they need to be very strict in containing them, because otherwise the healthcare system would just break down.
Okay, thank you. And there's a question that I think is on the mind of a lot of people. What was the rationale behind the crackdown on the technological sector?
Yes.
And does it have a negative impact on the development of technology?
Yep. Yeah, so this is I think an interesting question. I view it as a kind of a perfect storm of different factors. I think the starting point is to recognize that China's internet sector was very unusual in the sense that it was much more lightly regulated than pretty much any other sector of the economy. And it was very lightly regulated given the fact that these tech platforms, notably Alibaba and Tencent, were scooping up huge amounts of consumer data and using it privately. So other parts of the economy that are pretty deregulated, like manufacturing, you can deregulate those and it doesn't create much of a systemic threat. It was a little hard to understand why the government was so relaxed about a deregulated internet, given the enormous network impact that these companies has, the enormous amounts of data that they are scooping up about basically the entire Chinese population that they had and that the government didn't have. Okay, so that was an anomalous situation, and I think we were moving towards a tighter regulation of these companies. I think the move towards tighter regulation was, I think the first catalyst was COVID, because I think what the government recognized was in the early days of COVID, they then had to rely on these private companies, Alibaba and Tencent, essentially to set up these health apps that you have on your phone that monitor your activity. This was not a government thing. These are things that essentially relied on the infrastructure that Alibaba and Tencent had. And I think the government had started to think that it was dangerous to have private companies control this kind of critical public infrastructure. And then I think the other big catalyst clearly was a concern about financial risk, right? And if you remember, the trigger for the crackdown was the IPO of Ant Financial, which had a business model, to be frank, that seemed very close to the business model of a lot of American financial companies in the years before the global financial crisis of 2008. They were generating a lot of new lending activity. They were effectively securitizing this and putting it off on banks. And they were creating a lot of potential financial risks that were very difficult to manage. And they were also, again, they were in the business of collecting huge amounts of consumer financial data that they were refusing to share with the government. And then on top of that, we had the fact that Jack Ma, the head of Alibaba and Ant, gave a very ill-considered speech in which he directly and boldly criticized leading government officials in very harsh ways. So that was just a bad political move. But I think the underlying concerns there were that these tech companies had gotten too powerful. They had too much of a purchase on critical information infrastructure that really should be the purview of the government, and that they were creating social and financial risks, right? And one thing I would say about that is that some of these concerns are not unique to China, right? There's a huge discussion in the United States and Europe about, to do the big tech platforms like Facebook and Twitter and so forth, they have too much power. And there's clearly an effort to regulate these companies more strictly. And in fact, Europe has regulated their data use very strictly under its data privacy regime. So some aspects of what's going on in China are basically the same as what's going on everywhere in the world. People are looking at these big, unaccountable tech companies and saying, well, maybe they have too much power and they need to be regulated. But some of it is also, I think, China-specific concerns about, is the Communist Party going to be able to maintain control with all of these companies? Mm-hmm. So I think that was the impetus. I think an additional reason that they thought that it would be okay to regulate these companies much more tightly is that I think in the minds of many planners and of economic officials, these companies were really not that innovative, right? And if they looked at China's technological future, they said, well, what we want more semiconductor companies and more materials companies and more robotics and AI companies and people who are really inventing new stuff rather than just using monopoly positions in consumer markets to skim off gigantic profits. So their view was that you could regulate these guys and reduce their imprint without really causing a problem for China's technological future, right? And there's been a lot of good work done. In fact, Nick Lardy and his associates at PIE did a great a post a while ago showing that this crackdown affected the software companies, the internet software companies. It really had no impact on the wider ecosystem of sort of technology hardware companies. So from the standpoint of the Chinese government, I think they viewed it as an okay bet, and that they really were not sending a signal to the private sector that it was bad to be private. They were sending a signal to certain tech companies that what their business models were not approved. And so I think we'll have to see. It's still a little bit too early to tell whether they're right about that. And it may be that the private sector as a whole has taken this as a message that it's dangerous. Maybe they haven't. We'll have to see about that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And how do you see Brazil-China relations in this challenging international environment?
Yeah, well, I have to say is like for better or worse, it's sort of a sideshow. at the moment, all eyes are focused, basically on the European theater of operations. It strikes me that China's interests in Latin America broadly and Brazil particularly seem to be fairly stable, right? So there's clearly a lot of continuing interest in resources. There's clearly a lot of interest in making certain kinds of infrastructure investments that are potentially beneficial for the host country and also for the Chinese companies that get to build this stuff. So I would say at the economic level, my perception is that the degree of interest that China has in the Brazilian market as a destination for exports, as an investment destination, and as a supplier of certain kinds of particularly commodity goods, I don't see that changes that much. I think, Brazil is one of the countries that has, although they've condemned the Russian invasion, they've not joined in the sanctions regime. So like India and like a lot of the other countries outside of the US security alliance network, they have taken a more distanced relationship to the Russia-Ukraine issue. And clearly, I think from the standpoint of relations with China, that's helpful because, that's essentially where China is or is trying to be. So we don't have this sense that, Brazil is part of an alliance that is designed to contain China. So I think that's helpful from the Chinese point of view. I mean, I think where I would see the issue is, if you look at what is the language that is coming out of the US and increasingly out of Europe, is that there is a coalescence around a set of values, and they are constructing a global perspective that is strongly values-based, right? And this is what Biden is about when he talks about his, alliance of democracies and the competition between democracies and autocracies. And essentially, this is a position that the Europeans have taken in their reaction to the invasion of Ukraine. They have reacted much more strongly than I think anyone would have anticipated. And they have done so based, I think, on the view that the entire European construct is under existential threat, and that the European construct is built fundamentally on this concept of liberal open societies and democratic governance. And they have to set up very strong bulwarks against anything that would, threaten this, right? So you've had a intensification, I think, of the values coalition that the US is leading. And I think this creates an issue for large countries like Brazil or India would be the great examples of countries that are institutionally quite democratic and now have, both quite long histories of commitment to democratic societies, but in a geopolitical sense are, significantly less aligned. And I think neither country would see themselves as having a strong interest in joining one side or the other of a US-China Cold War, right? So I think the sort of the issue or the question for Brazil is, like, how do they, how do you create space for a more flexible relationship with countries like China, which clearly do not fit into the good guy democracy, camp that the US is trying to create. But they're also, it's a country that's very economically vibrant. It's really critical to Brazil's development to have strong commercial and investment ties with China. How do you keep doing this when there's increasing political pressure from the US to say, which side are you on, right? And this gets back to my earlier point, is that you can see this even within the United States, is that you have people who say, well, no, we're basically heading for a new Cold War. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. It's very clear. And then you have the business community in the middle saying, no, it's not. Actually, this is an economy with which we cannot disengage. It's a completely different thing than the Soviet Union. So that's, I think, the fundamental dilemma that everyone is facing right now, is that you have a high degree of economic interdependence. There are good reasons for that. There are good reasons to deepen that from the standpoint of domestic development and human welfare generally. But against this, you have this increasingly Cold War-ish security perspective that is putting more and more pressure on the economic actors to pull things apart. So I think that's the situation for Brazil. It's a situation for India. It's a situation for any major economy that is not directly a part of the US alliance network and would rather preserve space for options.
Thank you. We have one last question, very quick, which we go back to Ukraine. The imposition of sanctions on Russia led to this a great debate about, you mentioned that, the emergence of a new financial system, but there is also a debate about an alternative payment system, an alternative to SWIFT.
Yeah.
How likely, promising, and China has its payment system, not the CEBC.
Yeah.
How do you see this development?
I'm very skeptical of that whole thing. So yeah, China has this payment system. The transactions over it are trivial. There's also been discussion of maybe the digital central bank currency, the digital yuan that China launched. Well, it's sort of been launching it over the past year, but they made it more public at the Olympics. Maybe this becomes a way around the US payment system, because if you can directly do transactions in a digital currency, you don't have to go through these US dollar clearing mechanisms. Again, you look at that, the transaction volumes on this are trivial. So in China, for example, the digital currency accounts for 0.2% of all online transactions in China over the last 18 months, right? And it's growing, but it's, there's a lot of commitment to existing payments mechanisms. So globally, this is to the US dollar payment system. And domestically, this is to the payment systems that are run by Alibaba and Tencent, which are very convenient. It's just very difficult to change those things. And the binding constraint, it seems to me, in terms of China's ability to do this on a global scale is their capital controls, right? If you want to have payments in renminbi on a large scale, then people have to be willing to hold large renminbi balances so that they can make payments easily, right? If they're going to hold large renminbi balances, they have to have places to park that money, which basically means the Chinese bond and stock markets. And they need to have confidence that, whenever they need it, they can liquidate their holdings in the Chinese bond market, take the money out, and then pay whoever they need elsewhere in the world. This is how the dollar system works. If you're holding big dollar balances, you put a lot of money in US treasuries. Anytime you need to raise cash, you sell your treasuries, which you can do in large volumes very easily without changing the price. And then you take that money and you put it wherever you want. And there's basically no friction there. And in China, that's impossible because the government does not want to have free flows of capital, particularly out of the country, because they think if people take capital out of the country, that could destabilize their domestic market. So, and they really have not budged on that at all. And in fact, every time there is a crisis or a problem, they do things to strengthen capital controls and make it harder for people to move money in and out. And they've created mechanisms that enable people to invest money in the bond market and the stock market and so forth and get around these capital controls. But the only reason that those mechanisms work is that they are deliberately very small. So until China is willing to allow free flows of capital in and out of the country, I just don't see that it's possible for them to undergird a global payments system that is anywhere near the size that would be required to make a significant dent in the US payment system. And just finally, you can look at the Europeans have had an interest in this for a long time. So for example, after the US reimposed sanctions on Iran a few years ago, the Europeans didn't like that decision. They wanted to keep buying oil from the Iranians. They tried to come up with an alternative payment mechanism directly in euros. I think there were like 1 or 2 transactions over that network. It basically failed. And the euro is a much more sort of well-established and functional global currency than the renminbi is. And I think that just illustrates the inertia and the net power of network effects in global payment systems that are incredibly powerful and not likely to change anytime soon. So I basically see on any time horizon that you could reasonably forecast, I don't see that there's any chance for China coming up with a material, alternative to U.S. dollar payment system.
Thank you, Arthur. That was a great discussion. It was a pleasure listening to you as always. And I pass the floor now to Ambassador Castro Neves and Julia for the closing remarks. And thank you all for being with us.
Well, thank you all, and especially thank you, Arthur, for your presentation. It was really brilliant. And we are very proud. I think I can speak on behalf of not only Brazil-China Business Council, but also on behalf of the CEBRI. So this was a joint venture, and we are very happy about the presentation and the participation of all the viewers. You mentioned that we do agree on that the new world order is blurred so far. We haven't got any precise idea of how it will work. It has come to my mind that perhaps, as far as China is concerned, they want an international order which would be more favorable to them. And that brings about the question of a sort of a moral doctrine for Asia, in which the Chinese preach Asia for the Asians, and they argue that to the extent they are able to solve those inherited problems, the Korean Peninsula, the problem of Taiwan, South China Sea territorial disputes, with Japan, the Senkaku Diaoyu Island dispute, and what they call the historical liability of Japan in terms of not only China, but also other Asian countries. That would be, perhaps, if solving those Asian problems, that would extinguish the space for a US presence in East Asia. That might be perhaps one of the traces which the Chinese would desire. Before finishing that, I would ask you if you could comment very briefly about that.
Sure. Thank you very much. It's a very good question. I think there's no doubt that is kind of an ideal that a lot of people in the Chinese leadership have. I think it's basically impossible, again, on any sort of reasonable time horizon. I mean, the U.S. is heavily committed to alliance structures in Asia. It would take a lot to dislodge them. And I think the other thing is that most of the other countries in the region don't have a lot of interest in shifting in that direction. They mostly say, they don't want to join an anti-China alliance. But they also don't want to become sort of just satellites of China. And so they have a pretty strong interest in the US retaining a large strategic and economic position in the region. In fact, the critique that most Asian countries now have of US policy is that it needs an economic strategy for Asia, right? That they see the failing of the US is that it focuses too much on security, not enough on economics, and it needs to have a regional economic strategy, which of course the Trans-Pacific Partnership was supposed to be. So there is some instability there in that I think the countries in Asia would like more US participation, but they're disappointed that they're not seeing as much as they would like on the economic realm. And then I think finally, China may talk about how Asia for the Asians, et cetera, they don't actually have very good solutions for all of the problems that you mentioned on the Korean Peninsula or Taiwan or whatever. So they're not actually bringing a lot to the table in terms of how they would creatively solve these issues. And so again, I think this leads to a lot of mistrust in the rest of the region about what sort of a Chinese-led local order or regional order would be.
Well, thank you very much. And now we have come to the end of our presentation. I would like to thank you once again, Arthur, for your participation. I would emphasize also, especially thank Suzano Pulp and Paper Industries for their sponsorship, which was able to transform into reality our initiative. And in particular, I would also like to mention this joint venture between CEBRI and CEBC, which has been proving quite useful in terms of interesting our society more and more in international affairs. Brazil has been a very inward-looking country, and I think the contribution of CEBRI and also the contribution of the CEBC to that, persuading the Brazilian society that there is a world outside, is becoming some sort of reality. Thanks again, each and every participant of this webinar, and I hope to see you soon again in other situations. Thank you very much to all of you. Thanks, Julia. Thanks, Claude. Thanks, Arthur.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for this long-term relationship with the China-Brazil Business Council and CEBRI, and for another great presentation, hopefully to be next year here in Brazil.
Next year in person, yes. I'm looking forward to that.
And all the participants, the event will be recorded on YouTube of CEBRI and also CEBC. So for those who want to share and watch again. Thank you very much for all the participants.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.